The old corridors of St. Mary's Hospital carried an eerie stillness at night. The hum of fluorescent lights and the rhythmic beep of machines punctuated the silence. This silence was familiar to Sarah Connors, a nurse who had worked there for over a decade. She'd grown used to the subtle unease of the psych ward, where shadows often seemed to stretch too long, and the occasional inexplicable noise could make even the bravest staff member pause. That night began like any other. Sarah clocked in at 7 p.m., reviewed the patient files, and made her rounds. One file stood out. An elderly man named Thomas Whitaker, recently admitted to room 306. He was 87 years old and suffering from advanced dementia. His son had brought him in earlier, saying he was seeing things and muttering about shadows and doors. The admitting doctor chalked it up to his condition, but the son's parting words lingered with Sarah. "Please, keep an eye on him. He's different these days, not just confused, scared, like something's after him." Sarah brushed it off. She'd heard similar comments from worried families before, but as she read through the notes, a strange detail caught her attention. Mr. Whitaker had a history of wandering. During his stay at another hospital a year ago, he had disappeared from his room for hours, only to be found sitting calmly in a supply closet, muttering about being led back by the shadows. At 9 p.m., Sarah checked on Mr. Whitaker for the first time. He sat on the edge of his bed, staring at the wall. His hospital gown hung loosely on his frail frame, and his skin was pale, almost translucent under the fluorescent light. "Mr. Whitaker, how are you feeling?" Sarah asked, her voice gentle. He didn't respond. His lips moved, but no sound came out. Leaning closer, Sarah caught snippets of his murmurs. Open doors. Too many shadows in the hall. "Do you need anything?" She tried again. This time, he turned his head slightly, just enough for her to see his eyes. They were wide, unblinking, and filled with a fear that made her stomach twist. "They come at night," he whispered, barely audible. Sarah assured him he was safe and left the room, uneasy but determined not to let it rattle her. She instructed the orderly to double-check the locks on his door and ensure his alarm bracelet was secure. The bracelet was a precaution. It would trigger an alert if he tried to leave the room. By midnight, the ward was silent. Sarah began her second round, moving through the dimly lit halls. When she reached room 306, her steps faltered. The door was slightly ajar. That was odd. She was sure she had closed it earlier. "Mr. Whitaker," she called softly, pushing the door open. The room was empty. The bedsheets were rumpled, the pillow slightly indented as if someone had just been lying there. On the floor near the foot of the bed lay his alarm bracelet, the strap undone. Sarah's heart raced. She checked the bathroom, empty. She looked under the bed, in the closet, even behind the curtain. Nothing. Mr. Whitaker was gone. She grabbed the phone on the wall and dialed security. "This is Nurse Connors in the East Wing. I need a code yellow. Patient missing from room 306. Within minutes, the ward was a hive of activity. Security guards fanned out, checking every floor, stairwell, and exit. Sarah stayed in the room, staring at the discarded bracelet. How had he gotten it off? The straps were designed to be tamper-proof. By 2:30 a.m., the search had turned up nothing. Sarah joined the security team in the surveillance room, where they reviewed the hallway cameras. At 2:05 a.m., the footage showed Mr. Whitaker stepping out of his room. His movements were slow and deliberate, like someone in a trance. His hospital gown hung loosely as he shuffled down the hall, barefoot. "Pause it," Sarah said. The guard complied. She leaned closer to the screen, studying his face. His expression was vacant, but his eyes, they seemed to be looking at something. "What's he staring at?" one of the guards muttered. They played the footage again. Mr. Whitaker turned a corner and disappeared from view. The team switched to the next camera, expecting to see him emerge, but he never did. "Rewind it," the head guard instructed. This time, they watched more closely. As Mr. Whitaker rounded the corner, his shadow on the wall elongated unnaturally. It stretched far beyond what should have been possible, twisting and curling like smoke. "What the hell is that?" another guard whispered. The next camera captured Mr. Whitaker approaching the stairwell. He paused in front of the door, standing completely still. For several seconds, he didn't move. Then, without opening the door, he collapsed to the floor. The screen flickered. When the feed stabilized, Mr. Whitaker was gone. The only thing left was his hospital bracelet lying on the ground. The room fell silent. "Is this some kind of joke?" the head guard demanded, though his voice betrayed his fear. "No one touched the footage," another guard replied, shaking his head. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. "Where is he?" she whispered. No one had an answer. The hospital conducted an investigation over the following weeks, but no trace of Mr. Whitaker was ever found. His family was devastated, demanding answers that the staff couldn't provide. Rumors spread among the employees. Some claimed the ward was haunted, while others whispered about a cursed patient who had died in room 306 years ago and never left. Sarah couldn't shake the incident. She transferred to another ward, unable to bear walking past room 306, yet, even in her new position, she couldn't escape the memories. Late at night, when the halls were quiet, she sometimes thought she saw shadows shifting unnaturally at the edges of her vision. Years later, she learned that other patients had reported strange occurrences in room 306, whispering voices, sudden chills, and, on one occasion, a patient who claimed to see an old man standing at the foot of his bed, staring at him with wide, unblinking eyes. Sarah never spoke of that night again. But in her darkest moments, she couldn't help but wonder, where did Mr. Whitaker go? And what had he seen before he vanished? I've worked in hospitals for almost 20 years. You see a lot in this job: life, death, grief, and hope. It changes you, makes you a bit numb to things that might rattle someone else. I thought I'd seen it all. That was before the night I found myself face to face with something I still can't explain. I was pulling a double shift in the ER, the kind of night that leaves you running on adrenaline and stale coffee. By 2 a.m., I was ready to collapse, but there was still a pile of charts waiting for me. I decided to take a quick break, grab another cup of coffee, and clear my head. The elevators were just down the hall from the ER, and I headed straight for them. It was strange. When I got there, the hallway was completely empty. Normally, even in the dead of night, you'd see someone. A nurse rushing to check on a patient, a janitor mopping the floors. But this time, it was just me. The air felt heavier than usual, like the kind of pressure you feel before a storm. I ignored it and pressed the button. The elevator dinged almost immediately, and the doors slid open. Inside stood a woman, her back to me. She was wearing a hospital gown, the kind we give to patients. I hesitated for a second. She didn't move or acknowledge me. "Going down?" I asked. She didn't respond, just kept staring at the wall. I figured she was one of the psych patients who had wandered off, or maybe someone recovering from surgery. Either way, I wasn't going to leave her alone. I stepped inside, and the doors closed behind me. "Which floor?" I tried again, my voice steady. She didn't say a word. Her head tilted slightly, just enough for me to see her profile. Her skin was pale, almost gray, and her lips were dry and cracked. But it was her eyes that stopped me cold, wide, unblinking, and empty. I pressed the button for the lobby, telling myself she was probably heavily medicated. But the longer I stood there, the more I felt like something was wrong. The air in the elevator was colder than it should have been, and I swear I could hear a faint humming, like the static from an old TV. As the elevator began its descent, I stole another glance at her. She hadn't moved an inch. Her arms hung limply at her sides, and her breathing was so shallow I wasn't sure she was breathing at all. "Are you okay?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. That's when she turned to face me fully. Her movements were slow, almost mechanical, like she wasn't in control of her body. Her eyes locked onto mine, and for the first time, I noticed her pupils. They weren't black, they were white. I stumbled back, my hand instinctively going to the emergency button, but before I could press it, the elevator shuddered to a stop. The lights flickered, plunging us into darkness for a moment before the emergency lights kicked in. The humming grew louder, a low, vibrating sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Then she smiled. It wasn't a kind smile or a reassuring one. It was wide and unnatural, stretching her lips too far across her face. "This isn't your floor," she said, her voice soft but echoing like we were in a cavern. The elevator doors slid open, but instead of the lobby, I was staring into a long, dark hallway. It wasn't part of the hospital, that much I knew for sure. The walls were made of cracked concrete, and the floor was covered in a thick layer of dust. A cold draft blew in, carrying with it the scent of decay. "Go on," she said, stepping aside to let me pass. I froze, my back pressed against the elevator wall. "I'm not going anywhere," I stammered. Her smile faltered just for a moment, and in that instant the humming stopped. The silence was worse. It pressed down on me, making it hard to breathe. She leaned in closer, her face inches from mine. "You don't belong here," she whispered. The next thing I knew, the elevator doors closed on their own, and the lights flickered back to normal. The humming was gone and the elevator began moving again. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might stop. When the doors opened again, I was in the lobby. The woman was gone. I stumbled out, shaking, and found a security guard nearby. "Hey," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. There was a woman in the elevator with me, a patient in a gown. "Did you see her come out?" The guard frowned. "I've been here the whole time. You're the only one who came out of that elevator." I didn't know what to say. I just nodded and walked away, my hands trembling. In the weeks that followed, I tried to rationalize what had happened. Maybe I was overtired, hallucinating from the stress of the shift. But the memory of that humming sound, her smile, and that impossible hallway wouldn't leave me. Then, 2 weeks later, I overheard a conversation in the break room. One of the janitors was talking about the elevators. "You ever notice how sometimes they stop on a floor that doesn't exist?" he said, laughing nervously. I froze, my coffee halfway to my lips. "What do you mean?" another nurse asked. The old staff called it the phantom floor. "It's like the elevator glitches and takes you to this creepy, abandoned hallway. People used to joke it was where they kept the ghosts." They laughed, but I didn't. That night, I stayed late after my shift, determined to see if there was any truth to the janitor's story. I made my way to the same elevator and pressed the button. This time, when the doors opened, it was empty. I stepped inside, my heart pounding, and pressed the button for the lobby. The ride was smooth, uneventful. I almost laughed at myself for being so paranoid. But just as the doors were about to open, the elevator shuddered and stopped. The lights flickered, and the humming returned, louder than before. When the doors opened, I saw it again. The same dark hallway, the same cracked walls. And standing at the end of it was the woman in the hospital gown, her eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. She raised a hand and pointed at me. "You shouldn't have come back," she said. This time, I didn't wait. I slammed the emergency button and pressed every floor until the doors closed and the elevator moved again. When it finally reached the ground floor, I ran out and didn't stop until I was outside. I've avoided that elevator ever since. I still work at the hospital, but I can't go near it without feeling that cold draft or hearing that faint humming in the back of my mind. Some nights, when I'm walking past the lobby, I think I see her reflection in the elevator doors, and every time I hear her voice, "You don't belong here." I'll never forget that night. The night I learned to fear the one place in the hospital everyone else avoided, the morgue. My name is Jake, and at the time, I was a young medical intern, fresh out of school and eager to prove myself. Like most rookies, I often drew the short straw when it came to assignments. That night, it was paperwork duty. A simple task, really. Deliver some updated forms to the morgue for their files. But even the thought of going down there made my skin crawl. It wasn't just the dim lighting or the sterile chill of the basement air. The morgue had a reputation among the staff. Whispered rumors of strange noises and cold drafts. I didn't believe in ghosts or the supernatural, but I still couldn't shake the unease that crept over me as I rode the elevator down. The doors opened with a metallic groan, and I stepped out into the dimly lit corridor. The air was cooler here, carrying the faint smell of antiseptic mixed with something heavier, something earthy. The sound of my footsteps echoed as I walked toward the morgue, the envelope of paperwork clutched tightly in my hand. When I reached the morgue, I hesitated. The door was slightly ajar, a sliver of light spilling into the hallway. I pushed it open and stepped inside. The room was as cold and unwelcoming as I remembered. Rows of metal drawers lining the walls, each containing a body. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly, casting a pale, flickering glow. I placed the paperwork on the counter and turned to leave, eager to get back to the bustling, brightly lit ER. That's when I heard it. A soft, faint sound that sent a chill racing down my spine. Laughter. At first, I thought it might be my imagination, but as I stood there, frozen, the sound grew louder. It wasn't the warm, familiar kind of laughter you hear among friends. No, this was different. Unnatural, hollow, and echoing as though it came from every corner of the room. "Very funny," I called out, trying to mask the nervous tremor in my voice. "Who's there?" The laughter didn't stop. It grew louder and more distorted, as if multiple voices were laughing together, overlapping in a grotesque harmony. My heart pounded as I scanned the room. There was no one there. The drawers were all shut, the counters empty. The only movement came from the slight flicker of the overhead lights. "Hello?" I tried again, my voice barely above a whisper. Suddenly, the laughter stopped, cutting off as abruptly as it had started. The silence that followed was deafening, pressing down on me like a physical weight. I could hear my own breathing, rapid and shallow, and the faint hum of the lights overhead. I took a step toward the door, my instincts screaming at me to leave. But before I could reach it, the heavy steel door slammed shut with a deafening clang. I jumped, my pulse racing. "This isn't funny," I shouted, my voice echoing in the silence. I grabbed the door handle and yanked, but it wouldn't budge. It was as if something, or someone, was holding it closed. The laughter returned, louder this time. It echoed all around me, bouncing off the walls in a cacophony of mocking, hollow voices. My hands trembled as I pounded on the door, shouting for help. And then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it. One of the metal drawers, the kind used to store bodies, was slowly sliding open. The creaking sound was deafening in the oppressive silence. My breath caught in my throat as I watched, unable to look away. The drawer opened fully, revealing nothing inside. But then the laughter changed. It wasn't coming from everywhere anymore. It was coming from the empty drawer. I stumbled back, my heart hammering in my chest. The air grew colder, and my breath formed clouds in front of me. My back hit the wall, and I slid down to the floor, my legs refusing to move. The drawer remained open, the laughter spilling out of it like some malevolent force. Then, slowly, it began to close again. The sound of the metal scraping against metal was almost worse than the laughter. As the drawer clicked shut, the laughter stopped once more. The room was silent, save for the sound of my ragged breathing. And then, as suddenly as it had closed, the steel door swung open. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I scrambled to my feet and ran, not stopping until I was back in the brightly lit hallway. I leaned against the wall, my hands on my knees, trying to catch my breath. The next morning, I told the morgue supervisor what had happened. I expected him to laugh, to tell me I was overtired or imagining things, but instead, he gave me a strange look. "You're not the first one to hear it," he said, his voice low. "The laughing started years ago, after an autopsy went wrong." "Wrong? What do you mean?" I asked, my curiosity battling with my fear. He hesitated, glancing around as if to make sure no one else was listening. "There was a patient, a man who died under unusual circumstances. During his autopsy, the lights went out, and the doctors heard laughter. When the power came back on, the body was gone. They found it later, back in the drawer, as if it had never been touched." I stared at him, my stomach churning. "Most people say it's just a story," he continued. "But those who've been down there at night, they know better." I never volunteered for morgue duty again, and to this day, I can't hear laughter without feeling that cold, creeping dread.